Modernizing applications, or the oft-discussed app modernization idea, can be complicated, in part because your team may not have the skills. You may not have the skills. You may not fully understand what it even means to modernize an app. So we're going to look at, and hopefully demystify, a lot of that complexity so that you're served by understanding what does it look like to modernize an application? How does modernization of your application affect other things like your processes and your practices and your skills that your internal team might have? And lastly, what are 4 paths to get to app modernization? Because again, even if you understand what it is, you may not exactly know how to get there. And so what we'll look at today is the 4 paths, or 4 possible paths for you to go from a legacy app to a modern app through app modernization. So today we'll talk about what is app modernization, how do you actually modernize an app, and lastly, the 4 paths that I'd consider you can take. And these are paths that provide options, but they also express sort of the different nuances to modernizing applications. So first, what is app modernization? It's taking a legacy app, and that's a fun word, really. All that just means is an app that can't be modernized and modernizing it. App modernization, of course, involves technology change. Also keep in mind it involves modernizing your organization. So frequently when I explain app modernization to people, I talk about 2 things, right? Number 1, it is a modern architecture, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's also modern practices. It's being able to leverage things like Agile software development, things like Scrum or Kanban. The market changes quickly, and so often you need iteration, not just in your lower level way you're building and releasing software, you need it at the higher level. You need to leverage iterative and incremental planning, iterative product management and product design, a cloud literacy. So you might say, well, actually, Eric, I'm not even trying to go to the cloud. That makes sense, and you might not therefore need people on your team that are Azure or AWS or Google Cloud experts. But I think it does help if you have people who understand, I would call it the base fundamental problems that the cloud is solving. Things like automated scalability, things like everything is software enabled, so everything having a set of APIs. The ability for teams to collaborate together as needed, but also to be able to work in their unique and individual functions as necessary. These are all principles that get delivered through public cloud that, again, your teams should be literate in, you should understand. And of course, if you're going to the public cloud, you need that. I mean, you need people on your team who understand how those principles apply to the specific cloud that you're migrating into. But your team needs a cloud literacy. Related to that, and I mentioned it, collaboration, you probably need to start to think about DevOps. One author calls it the zone of contention, right? It's like that your operations team and your developers and your development teams have conflicted priorities. In one case, maybe even opposite priorities. One is trying to keep as little change impacting production, and the other team, your dev team, is trying to introduce as much change as possible into your environment. And so DevOps seeks to solve that problem. In much the way Agile software development has brought together QA teams, user experience teams, development teams, business analysis teams, project management teams, all into a shared context, DevOps seeks to do the same thing, right? To keep people talking more frequently. And then lastly, SecDevOps. DevOps, but then secure, both secure DevOps, which is often the thought that's applied to the abbreviation SecDevOps or DevOps that's secure, but also SecDevOps has to do with treating security as often a subdiscipline, a risk-oriented subdiscipline of infrastructure management as code. So thinking about security and policies and access control lists, all of this as software allows you, much like in the DevOps context, to automate and collaborate around a shared vocabulary. SecDevOps does the same, right? It unifies teams by getting them together. By the way, if any of these practices are attractive to you, but you have struggled to figure out, how am I going to get my current app, I'm going to call it your legacy app, how am I going to get my legacy app to support these practices, or vice versa? How are these practices relevant to me? I really would love to do DevOps, but how is DevOps relevant to my app? Well, then you might, as I said, need to modernize the app itself, which goes into probably the topic that comes to your brain when you think about app modernization. You need to modernize the architecture. It needs to be cloud native. It needs to support platform services, and that's not just hosting the app in a platform as a service or PaaS model. You also need to think about databasing and caching and a variety of other technologies that allow you to worry less about the infrastructure than you historically would have, because as a platform service, probably hosted in a public cloud, that's the service that the cloud provides. It's not necessarily something you have to worry about anymore. One of the important processes to employ when thinking about app modernization is thinking about your app as a set of services. And so this is an idea that surfaced during the service-oriented architecture boom of the early 2000s. And then obviously we now have the concept of microservices and serverless and function as a service and all these other really kind of interesting ways to think about loose coupling. But at the end of the day, it's really just about thinking of your app less as a big bucket of functionality and more as a set of integrated services and scaled independently of each other. And that's the promise of microservices. One of the most important trends has been how much open source and as a service software are at your disposal now. If you struggle to bring in third-party software of any kind, be it as a service or off-the-shelf open source software, maybe you really would love to pull in this library from GitHub, but you just can't because your app needs to be modernized. And so flexible components, componentry that allows your app to exist in a unique way, but also to leverage best practice services and best practice code so that you're not having to write that stuff that largely has, you're not trying to solve problems that have already been solved. And then lastly, modern apps are secure apps. If your current app is insecure in some fundamental ways, it may very well be that way because you need some of the things we talked about. You need to deploy some of the practices we talked about. But also your app needs to leverage these technical themes and capabilities to be more secure. Now I've given you two buckets or areas of focus, both the practices, modern practices in your organization, but also a modern architecture for that modern app. But how do you get there? I've seen 4 really common approaches to modernizing your app. I call these paths. So we'll think about if you've got a journey to modernizing your application. These are 4 ways or journeys or paths to take to get there. Number 1, you could go out and hire a brand new team. There's also, you could invest in training or mentorship or partnership with a third party so that your internal team can grow. We've seen this a lot where companies don't want to augment their internal team with new hires. They also don't want to, in a sense, clean house. They want to keep the people who've been a part of their organization for a long time, and they're valuable people and resources and have lots of context and history. But lastly, it might be mentorship and developing the skills within the team and allowing that team to grow into these, again, more modern practices, but also picking up some technology skills they may not have so they can modernize the architecture. Option 2 is to do it a different way, is you outsource, you keep the existing team working probably on a legacy app, and then you partner with somebody who can come in and directly take your legacy app and modernize it. This can happen in concert with path 1. You can modernize the team and modernize the architecture. I mean, these are really effectively 2 different things. And one of the ways that this second path helps is it's disruptive to take your existing team who's trying to keep the lights on, who's trying to fix bugs, and that can be a distraction. And so if you need your existing team to continue to keep the lights on, and yet you got to get over the hump, so to speak, in terms of modernizing what is potentially lots and lots and lots of aspects of your existing legacy app, then you can, again, modernize the architecture directly and then modernize the team, you could say, on the way or even later. Path 3, which we've seen a lot, and I think is a great approach, is you defer the really complicated parts of the modernization until a little bit later when you've modernized a little bit less difficult aspects. I mentioned platform as a service. One of the ways to get to a more modern architecture is by leveraging public cloud. We talked about that being cloud native, leveraging platform services. So if you modernize in layers, one of the ways to get ready for a modernization, or maybe even you could argue to modernize an aspect or a layer of your app, is move your database from your self-hosted server to platform as a service, maybe RDS in AWS, or to MySQL as a service in Azure. We will often see this approach. So this path is often mixed a little bit with the fourth path, which is to modernize by decoupling. So one of the reasons why microservices, which I described a little bit earlier, is linked to app modernization is because often the inhibitors of a legacy app, either practice or architecture or both, are a highly coupled, inflexible, tends to be brittle, they call them monoliths, right? If you experience an issue or a bug or downtime related to this part of your app, it's going to take the whole app out of commission, so your whole app goes down. So some of the triggers from app modernization are those kinds of issues, and so therefore the logical thing is to move to microservices. Well, if you think about it, one of the ways you can get to microservices is by slowly taking pieces, components out of that legacy app and service enabling them. There are 4 paths to app modernization. Number 1, you modernize the team by helping them grow, or you grow the team. Option 2, you largely outsource or you separate the modernization of the architecture from your existing team. Path number 3 is you modernize in layers. You might start with a less complex layer. And then lastly, your 4th path, if you're thinking about microservices, you modernize your app effectively a service at a time by decoupling. The idea would be a service at a time. You move it from your legacy pattern to the more modern approach.